what's the most common inherited bleeding disorder? You're going to say von Willebrand deficiency. Now, keep in mind, we are talking about a bleeding diseases, not a clotting diseases. Is that clear, folks? All this makes blood bleeding. Okay. Now, the second thing to learn, they said sometime, or let's say 50% of the time, the von Willebrand factor and the factor VIII, they both are carried together in the endothelial cells. So anytime you lose von Willebrand factor, you also lose factor VIII. Now, what is that factor VIII? Factor VIII belongs to PTT, so they say it's also increase in PTT. Is everybody clear, folks? That's why it's a mixed clotting factor and platelets. In another word, the one and only disease that has increased bleeding time and increased PTT, it has to be von Willebrand factor. Is that clear, folks? That's a von Willebrand factor deficiency. Now, before I go further, is everybody clear with the basics on von Willebrand? Okay. Now, I'm going to talk about ristocetin in a moment. Let's take a look at the treatment. We give desmopressin, which release von Willebrand if they are stored inside the endothelium. So that's a third disease we are studying. Desmopressin is an answer, okay? So keep a track of it. So that's the key, folks. Now let's talk about ristocetin. Okay. Ristocetin, all it does, activates or it brings GP1B, okay? They can only replace GP1B. So you could technically think, if I am adding a ristocetin in the blood, I'm technically adding a GP1B. Is everybody clear, folks? So now, if a patient is coming with a bleeding, and let's say I'm telling you it's a platelet adhesion deficiency. When I say platelet adhesion deficiency, it has to be either GP1B or von Willebrand factor deficiency. It has to be one of these two, isn't it, folks? Right? If I give ristocetin, ristocetin will bring GP1B back because it's almost ristocetin is a GP1B, okay? So if I have a patient with adhesion deficiency and the question says, given ristocetin makes it better, then you know all this time the problem is GP1B. Is everybody clear, folks? Now, let me repeat again. If a patient has platelet adhesion deficiency, that's either this or this. Did we get that? Now, the minute we give ristocetin, if the situation get better, that means if the platelet adhesion is happening after that, it's GP1B, because all this time GP1B wasn't there. That's why as soon as we give ristocetin, GP1B is working. If I tell you patient has platelet adhesions problem and we give ristocetin, still the same, did not get better, it's von Willebrand factor. Is that clear? That's simple. Now let's go back. Let's see here first. No platelet aggregation with ristocetin cofactor because I don't like the way it's written here or it's written here also, folks. Okay, so you're gonna make a statement here or somewhere what I wrote. GP1B versus von Willebrand factor. So giving ristocetin will make this better. Is everybody clear, folks? I'll show you a question. It will improve. So if I give ristocetin, GP1B should get better. So people with this Bernard-Sollier syndrome, if I give ristocetin, they should get better. Does that make sense, folks? But they wrote abnormal ristocetin test. That's wrong, the way they wrote. So you have to put ristocetin makes it better. Ristocetin makes it better. I repeat this, they make it better, folks. Make sure you write that.
So ristocetin basically it's testing if GP1B is there.
Say it again?
it basically tests, like, it's a test to determine
Yeah.
if
So
GP1 is.
giving ristocetin activates GP1B.
So when you give them, the GP1B is activated. So that means the problem is not in GP1, or it's in.
The problem is GP1B.
The problem is GP1.
Don't complicate. So if a patient has a platelet adhesion problem, it's either GP1B or von Willebrand factor deficiency. If I give ristocetin and if the patient gets better, that means the adhesion is happening. That's GP1B. If I give ristocetin, nothing is getting better. That's a von Willebrand factor, because ristocetin doesn't do anything to do with von Willebrand factor. Is that clear?
Yeah.
Okay. That's, make sure you guys write it that way. Otherwise, this will become a confusion, folks. Okay. I have a question, but let's finish one more disease and then we'll talk about it. Next, disseminated intravascular coagulations. Let's talk about this disease. In a layman word, this is the only medical condition in the body. Clotting and bleeding, they both are happening at the same time. Okay, clotting and bleeding is happening at the same time. How does it work? In one part of the body, you have clotting happening, and some other part of the body, you have bleeding. Okay, a good example, let's say most commonly in the US, it happens in OB/GYN. Okay, now in uterus, all the clotting factors are causing clotting. So in the uterus, you have a clotting. Somewhere else, you will be bleeding. Is that clear, folks? So that's DIC. Now, if you see the lab value, pretty interesting. Platelet count is decreased, everything else is increased. Okay, platelet count is decreased, everything else is increased. The reason platelet count is decreased is in clotting. Everything is causing clotting. So all the platelets are part of clotting. They are not in the blood circulation, not enough. Is everybody clear, folks? Now, let's take a look. Widespread clotting factor activation. So they're activating the clotting factor. So there's a thromboembolic state with excessive clotting factor consumption. So all the clotting factors are consumed in one location where that clotting is happening. That causes increased clotting. But then on the other part, there's an increased bleeding. Imagine if all the clotting factor goes to uterus, you might bleed in the shoulder because there's no clotting factors there. Is that clear, folks? So one part is doing. Now, I want you guys to highlight this word. So the question says this. The patient, they were trying to put IV line. As soon as they put IV line, they started bleed through that IV line. So they're oozing through the puncture site. Is that clear, folks? So they use that word, okay? It might be acute life-threatening or chronic clotting, okay? Any of those things can be. DIC can happen with the heat stroke, snake bites. It's also happening in certain countries. Sepsis. Now, obstetric complication is the most common in the United States, folks, okay? So that's the idea. Especially when they remove placenta, they leave a piece inside, and then it causes infection and all this catastrophic effect. Now, lab, schistocytes. Increased fibrin degradation products, that D-dimers, because when you have a clot, your body tries to break it down, okay? D-dimers and all the other factors, but the key is D-dimers and schistocytes. Now, you can't miss this question because you have decreased platelet and every other factors is increased, bleeding time, PT, PTT. Is everybody clear, folks? So that's DIC. Now,